Hello, I'm Gary York, author of Corruption Behind Bars and Inside the Inner Circle. I wanted to take a few moments today to talk to you about mental illness behind bars and the court system. Mental illness in our prison system is not only an issue at the correctional institutions and the jails on how to handle inmates with mental illness, but it's becoming a very big issue in the criminal justice system and the courts. Recently, the Supreme Court ruled that an indigent Alabama death row inmate had the right to psychiatric assistance in a trial before determining his death penalty. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of the inmate's rights. Courts at the state level and at the Supreme Court level are having a very difficult time determining what they should do in different cases with mental health inmates. An example, as a prison inspector, when I worked as a prison inspector during internal investigations, I would have officers who were assaulted by mental health inmates, and I would conduct a criminal investigation. When I would interview the inmates who were the subjects of the investigation, many times the inmates would be wandering, their mind would wander. They would tell me that they had things implanted in their body, they're being followed, they're being watched. There was all kinds of issues I had when dealing with mental health inmates during a criminal investigative interview. Some of these inmates were severely mentally ill, some were mildly diagnosed, and I do have to say that some of them, I believe, were playing the game of being mentally ill to try to get out of trouble, to try to be moved to a different prison. But in some cases, they were legitimately mentally ill. And I would call the state attorney and say, we need to prosecute this inmate who just assaulted this correctional officer. And the state attorney would be very reluctant in many of the counties that I traveled in prosecuting this inmate because of the mental illness. They would have me go and interview the prison psychologist and try to determine the mental state of the inmate. And I would interview the prison psychologist and find out what types of medication the inmates were on, what they were diagnosed with, and then I would put this in my investigative report and send it to the state attorney's office. And many, many times the state attorneys would decline prosecution. Now, we have now a correctional officer who was assaulted by an inmate and nothing's going to happen. I would talk to the state attorneys and say, well, listen, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a prison inspector conducting an investigation. But how did the inmate get to our prison in the first place? Did they just all of a sudden become incompetent to stand trial? They must have been competent to stand trial in order to be sentenced to prison, or they could have taken a plea. There could have been a plea agreement made, but many of them did have trials and still ended up in prison. So why is it okay for them to be competent to be sentenced to prison, but when they assault a correctional officer, we're going to avoid prosecution? I urge everyone out there in the correctional system to, if you're assaulted by an inmate and they are claiming mental ill status, I'm going to tell you right now that in some cases the state attorney will just not prosecute. They say that there's just no way they can do it. But you, as a correctional officer, on duty or off duty as a citizen, have the right to go to that state attorney's office and demand they prosecute. As a prison inspector, I went with the officers many times to the state attorney's office for deposition. And I would stand with the officer and we would say, please prosecute this inmate. And in some cases, they would attempt to prosecute the inmate. In some cases, they did prosecute the inmate. And in other cases, they just totally refused to prosecute based on the mental health status of the inmate. So as you can see, it's a dilemma, not only for the correction officers having to deal with mental illness, but it's a dilemma for the court system also. What I would like to see happen is every prison and jail make it mandatory for more crisis intervention training, more training for officers on how to deal with mentally ill inmates. But what I would really like to see happen is the legislature take action to find alternatives for some of these inmates besides prison or jail. Correctional officers are not psychologists, and they don't have the training for the mentally ill that is needed in many cases. Some of these mentally ill inmates must be sentenced to prison. We know that. There's no way around it. But many do not have to be in our jails and prisons. Just last month, in December of 2017, the Boston Globe reported that legislature is now finally starting to pay attention to the problem of mental illness in our prisons, and they are trying to get a bill together to have other alternatives for some of the mentally ill inmates so they will not fill our prisons and jails. And it may benefit not only the prisons and jails, but it may benefit some of these inmates that we have with mental illness that do not have severe crimes. All crimes are severe, I understand that. But some of the crimes, maybe we could divert some of these mental illnesses over to different programs and away from the prisons and jails. So I was glad to see that the Boston Globe has reported a little initiative from the legislature to move in a direction to try to take some action on this issue. We need to see that done, and it is a hindrance for internal investigations within the prison system, and it is a hindrance for many of the officers. I would like to note to all the officers out there that recently 3 correctional officers just were sentenced to 15 years each for the brutality of an inmate. Don't let any inmate get you caught up in a trap. It's not worth it. We want you to stay healthy and stay safe, and please, let's all work together to try to figure out what we can do with mentally ill inmates attacking officers and how we can get something done about it and how we can fix this issue. We know staff shortages is one issue. We know that crisis intervention training is another issue, training for mentally ill inmates. There's not enough time in the day and not enough staff anymore to take care of these issues. So somebody needs to stand up and talk, and somebody needs to listen, and that's the legislature, that's prison management, and that's anybody out there who cares about the safety and security of the prison staff and the inmates. I'm Gary York, Corruption Behind Bars. Please think about what I just talked about, and I thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for other topics of this nature in prison and training videos regarding issues in our prisons. Thank you very much. Have a great day.